Four Horsemen of Death. I guess defining what these are first is probably the best place to start, because these are kind of like classifying these into subcategories is the most easy way to, I think, digest what is the lowest hanging fruit.
Yeah, so I think the idea of thinking about these diseases a lot is I think an entirely obvious one. I don't think there's any earth-shattering insight that comes from the realization that if you want to think about longevity and you understand that part of longevity is lifespan, i.e. how long you live, then you have to have some sense of understanding what compromises lifespan. So obvious, it's almost not worth stating. Yet it's interesting to me how little attention is paid to it from the standpoint of prevention. So if you're not a smoker, and that's a big if, but you know, smoking rates today in the US are probably in the 16 to 18% range. So still, I think, unacceptably high, but much lower than they were historically.
That's pretty high.
It is.
I wasn't even aware.
Yeah, we'd expect lower, but you know, I think at one point, gosh, it was probably 40% in the 60s. So if you take smoking out of the equation, what accounts for most deaths is the Four Horsemen. So what are they? So the first is a bucket that I would just refer to as all diseases of the cardiovascular system and atherosclerotic disease. So that would be, you know, ischemic heart disease, cerebrovascular disease, and other, you know, vascular disease as it pertains to the aorta and things like that. So that's bucket number one. And that's true in the United States, but it's also true worldwide. It's true in men and it's true in women. So heart disease, which we can just, you'll hear me use shorthand all the way through. Sometimes I'll just talk about it, ASCVD, atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease. Number two is cancer. Again, I think this is also number two, both for men and women, and it's also, this is also true globally. The gap globally is much bigger. In the US, it's actually quite close. Cancer and ASCVD are quite close. Globally, they're not close at all. ASCVD is probably 60 or 70% more deaths than cancer. Again, I'm excluding smokers, so I'm taking out chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, COPD, which is a significant cause of death. But again, it really tracks almost exclusively with smokers. And so then your third bucket is all of the neurodegenerative diseases and dementias. And that's a bit of a, you know, that's not the cleanest way to divide the data, because you have certain neurodegenerative diseases that are dementia. So for example, Lewy body dementia and Alzheimer's disease, which is the most common form of dementia and the most common neurodegenerative disease, belong in that bucket. But there are other forms of dementia, such as vascular dementia, which is also quite prominent, that is not a neurodegenerative disease, but is, you could almost think of it more as belonging in the ASCVD category. So it's a disease that is driven by the same pathology as atherosclerosis, except the organ that we're talking about is the brain as opposed to the heart, as far as the final, you know, proximate cause of demise. And then you sort of get into this fourth and final horseman, which actually on the death certificate doesn't amount to a staggering number of deaths, but it's so important because not only does it result in mortality, but it is what I kind of think of as a force multiplier for the others. In other words, if you are along this spectrum of metabolic disease, which we can define in a minute, your risk of those first three horsemen goes up significantly, probably anywhere from 40% to 100%. So what do I mean by that metabolic disease? So that would be anything from hyperinsulinemia, which would be the canary in the coal mine, to insulin resistance, to all the forms of fat accumulation that are suboptimal, i.e. where fat is not to be accumulating. So NAFLD being the easiest to diagnose, and NASH, and then all the way to type 2 diabetes. So that spectrum of diseases, again, clearly results in mortality. There are people who die directly as a result of their type 2 diabetes. There are people who die directly as a result of liver failure. In fact, the leading cause of liver transplantation is very rapidly converging on NAFLD and NASH. Again, this is in part due to the miracle drugs that have come along that can eradicate Hep C, which was otherwise taking the sole, title of the main cause of liver failure, leading to cirrhosis that would ultimately require transplantation. But now that Hep C is curable, and the incidence of metabolic disease is rising so dramatically, those two things have basically led to a complete flip of that. And both alcoholic and non-alcoholic fatty liver disease are quickly becoming the main things that drive that. So look, you're going to die directly from those things, but the more important point here is when you have those things, even if they don't kill you, they are pouring gasoline on the fire of things that will.
No, that's very all-encompassing, I would say, as far as framing out, preface of what to focus on, and the lowest hanging fruit, I guess, overlap fairly significantly. One thing I think will stand out is what you mentioned at the beginning is the rate or how many people die from cancer versus ASCVD, and it being dramatically different in terms of US versus elsewhere. What do you chalk that up to in that difference?
I actually chalk it up to one thing that the U.S. is doing reasonably well, which compared to the rest of the world, which is I think we do have better tools that we're using to delay the onset and probably make it so that less people are dying of heart disease here. If you do look at cardiovascular mortality, it is declining. Now, I would argue it shouldn't be the #1 cause of death. I would argue ASCVD shouldn't be on the top 10 causes of death. So I still think, I don't want to suggest that like we're winning, because I still think it's an abomination that anybody dies of heart disease, because of all the preventable disease, of all the chronic diseases, it's the most preventable. I can't say that about cancer. I can't say that about neurodegenerative disease. But if you begin the steps of prevention early enough, nobody should die of a heart attack, at least within the first 90 years of their life. So obviously, if you live long enough, I think everybody probably would if you figured out a way to eradicate every disease except ASCVD, then yes, I think eventually we would all succumb to it. But within a generous lifespan, nobody should be dying of this. And the tools that are required to do that, I think the US probably implements slightly better. It also might be the case, although to be honest with you, I haven't looked into this, so this is speculation. I do wonder what the difference is in US cancer rates versus global cancer rates. There are clearly going to be certain cancers that are different. So for example, a cluster of cancers is significantly worse if you have insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes. I would guess that we're faring much worse on those cancers than the rest of the world. So again, there could be many factors that explain that gap, but it's literally to the tune of 13 million versus 19 million globally.
Okay.
Huge gap.
See, I wasn't sure if it was that cancer was much more prevalent in the US, but it sounds like it's largely that ASCVD is maybe managed to a proportionally...
I think it's managed better here. And like I said, maybe certain cancers are more prevalent. I would have to believe that lung cancer would be more prevalent globally. And lung cancer is both the leading cancer and the leading cause of cancer mortality. And global rates of smoking are much higher. So again, this is something that I would probably have to sit down and look at the data to come up with a good answer.